Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to have all of you with us. Glad that we have most of the individuals back from their sicknesses. As I overheard somebody explaining, somebody's still feeling a little bit under the weather, so we'll hope they'll get to feeling better. But we're moving through our Matthew study, Matthew chapter 24. Last time we were together, we got up to verse 14. What are we talking about? Or what is Jesus talking about in this context?
The revelations.
The revelation, singular. But then, what is this revelation revealing?
The destruction of Jerusalem.
All right. Destruction of Jerusalem. The signs that will appear before this happens. The signs of the destruction, and then even that with the reference of Jesus and His coming. We mentioned this last time, how that the apostles they're not attaching everything together, but they are putting some things together to where they are recognizing, okay, Jesus has already mentioned the fact that He's going to be involved in doing this. Who remembers where we made that connection last week?
Was it Psalms?
Nope. It's New Testament. Jesus has already made a statement about destroying a temple. Okay. Where is that? Use your cross references, use your notes. Where Jesus says, in 3 days, I will destroy this temple and build it again.
That's talking about himself.
Talking about Himself.
John 2:19.
John 2:19. So early in Jesus' ministry, He's already making these statements. Now, granted, like we said, the apostles do not know what it is He's actually discussing. They just know that He's made this statement before. Now here they are after Matthew 23, and He says about the temple, your house is left to you desolate. And He walked away at the end of that chapter, and now here they are, and they're bringing up these questions. Okay, we've heard this before, and we recognize you are going to be involved in this. Thus, all of the discussion that we've been through so far has been discussing those questions that they asked in relation to the temple, to the Jewish system, to that age, that time frame that's going to come to an end. All right? Verse 15, Jesus gives them further information, things in which they can look forward to. Here's how you know these things are coming. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel, the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Mark 13:14 gives a similar description of this. But when ye shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel, the prophet, standing where it ought not, let him that readeth understand. Then let them that be in Judea flee to the mountains. Desolation simply means to lay waste, to be brought to naught. It is a despoilation. So inside of that word you have spoiling that takes place. Like how a nation will spoil another nation when they conquer it. They take them as victory. So it's the act of plundering or spoiling, especially during war. Thus Jesus is preparing them with this phrase and with this word for what's ahead. A battle is coming. But it's not, and a war is coming, but it's not just simply a battle and a war and that the fight is on and then the fight is over. A spoiling is going to take place. And He's already stated to what degree that's going to happen. There's not going to be one stone left upon another. Now, reason for that? Well, let me ask. Why wouldn't there be one stone left upon another of the temple?
So they can't rebuild?
All right, can't rebuild, but think about in 23, Jesus raises a point of hypocrisy with the Pharisees in that section where they are swearing by certain things and then swearing by others. And he brings up the temple, and there's something in the temple.
The gold of the
Say it. Say it. Christina has the answer. She just won't say it. There's gold interlaid in the temple. It's overlaid and it's also interlaid in between stone. So when the Romans come in and they're spoiling, they're grabbing their loot. They're going to get everything that they can. So right there, as we're thinking about the design of the temple, and it's just, oh, let's do this and it'll be so grand and it'll be so marvelous. No, that's going to be your downfall. Thus, this desolation, laying waste and bringing to naught, complete, utter, axe being laid at the roots, not coming back. But then when we also take into consideration what is being described here, what is going to happen, number one, that's being prophesied by Daniel, they've already seen once before. Daniel the prophet, Daniel chapter 9, verse 25. But where is Daniel when he's making this prophecy? He's in Babylon. He's in captivity. What had happened to the temple at this time? It had been destroyed. So here is a prophet in captivity after being overrun and conquered by another nation and having their homeland and temple destroyed, and he's writing about it going to happen again. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks. Now also remember, at the beginning of this chapter is when Daniel is reading the prophecies, Jeremiah, Isaiah, for example, and he is recognizing, okay, the time of our captivity is coming to an end. The 70 years are up. And at that recognition, he begins to pray. God sends an angel to converse with Daniel during that time frame, and this is what ends up coming about. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah and the Prince shall be 7 weeks. And 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, the wall, even in troublous times. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the Prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abomination he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. Now, I know a lot of individuals want to get caught up in the 7 weeks, 62 weeks, shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and they want to get lost into that and trying to break it down into the timeline. But with what Jesus is presenting in Matthew chapter 24, we're able to understand what the timeline actually is. And Daniel even says it. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth to the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem. So that's them leaving captivity. That's Ezra, Nehemiah, going back, rebuilding Jerusalem, rebuilding the temple, unto Messiah, the Prince, shall be 7 weeks. Now, we know that's not a literal 7 weeks, because there were still hundreds of years between the going back and restoring to the building of Jerusalem and the birth of Christ. So it's not a literal 7 weeks. But all of this is laying out the timeline of them going back, rebuilding to the time frame in which the Messiah should come. And then Jesus, even further, puts a timestamp on it that this is leading into the destruction of Jerusalem, because he references the same desolation that Daniel prophesied about. So here's your timeline, here's your timetable that they're actually working with. So First desolation. Antiochus Epiphanes the fourth, 167 to 164 BC, destroyed Jerusalem and actually went so far as to offer a sow on the altar and sprinkled the pig broth in the holy place and the most holy place of the temple. That is an unclean animal that is never to touch the altar, never to be entered into these places, and so a defilement. It's a sign of, okay, my God is stronger than your God. But when we're considering the desolation that ends up taking place, or that took place, that Jesus is prophesying about with the destruction of Jerusalem, Jesus hymns it in even further in Luke chapter 21 and verse 20. When ye shall see Jerusalem encompassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Here is the second one. Here it is going to happen again. So when we're considering from this standpoint, what it is that Jesus is presenting to His apostles, and even as we studied last time, this information is a part of the gospel that they're carrying out, part of the Great Commission. And then you would have the Pharisees, Sadducees in particular, because they were really caught up in the elements of the temple. And then to say to themselves, oh, this could never happen. You know, we could never see the temple, Jerusalem, be conquered by armies. It happened in your history. Every Sabbath day that you're getting together and you're reading about Isaiah, Jeremiah, the other prophets, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, all of them, and they're warning of the desolation that's coming during that time frame, and then you want to sit here and think, yeah, but that would never happen to us. It's just crazy to imagine that could happen to a people, but just think about us and our modern history. To have, literal attacks on our country. Pearl Harbor happens, and then we just go on through our lives like, yeah, but that, we study about that in our books, like, yeah, but that never happened again. And then other things happen. You never get too comfortable, too relaxed to think that you're beyond the area of where you can be reached. Were you going to say something?
I was going to say, just like Hitler and controlling all, to make the Jews look bad or things like that, you look at what happened with the mask deal.
Yeah.
Like how many people wearing masks, still today,
Yeah.
even wearing masks in their car by themselves. And it's like, how just in their mind, that'll never happen to me. And then they're driving in their car with a mask on. It's like, you see the control happening and just going with what you're saying. Same thing, falling back right into place.
Yeah. Even with this, it is the level of control that brings about destruction of millions. Millions of Jews ended up losing their lives because of the leadership saying, this will never happen. This is, we have the temple and this and that. God is on our side. We can fall into that same snare. Oh, we're Christians. We're members of the Church of Christ. We don't worship mechanical instruments, music. We teach that baptism is for the remission of sins. But then we end up becoming corrupted on the inside just like they were. But yet we deceive ourselves and thinking, but God's on our side. It's a dangerous line. So as Jesus is going through and He's telling this to His apostles, He's warning them, as this is happening to the Jews, it can also happen to you. So here is the desolation. When you see these things and you see it being surrounded by armies, the encircling of the Roman army, know that Daniel is fulfilled. And we already know from reading Paul's writings to brethren, that this working of wickedness and this pollution was already taking place. It was already at work. 2 Thessalonians 2, 3 through 7. Let no man deceive you by any means, and this is in context of this destruction that's supposed to take place. Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that the man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worship, so that he, as God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. So a lot of people want to focus in on, well, it's the entering into the temple and the defilement of it by Roman legions and different things like that. But what Paul is writing about that actually brings about this desolation is already at work. Remember ye not that when I was yet with you, I told you these things. And now ye know what withholdeth that he might be revealed in his time. For the mystery of iniquity doth already work. Only he who now letteth will let, until he be taken out of the way. At this time of Paul's writing, there is already somebody who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worship, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God. It's already taken place. That defilement, that pollution is already in play before the Romans even get there. Thus further illustrating just how bad the Jewish system had become. How corrupted. To where then, as he now lays it out plainly, and he's showing to them, okay, a battle is coming, Jerusalem is going to be surrounded, what do you need to do? You got to run. Matthew 24:16. And notice some very peculiar things, some very specific things that are mentioned here in this warning. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house, neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. Now, look at how specific this warning is, and where this is going to take place. Then let them which be in Judea. Why are we honing in on Judea? I thought this was a warning to the entire world. I thought this is everything that this is something that everybody throughout the world is needing to pay attention to. No. Now, everybody in the world is going to know about it, but the things that are going to be done, the signs, the destruction, end of the age, look at how it's hemmed in to the area of Judea. This is not a worldwide destruction.
And if it was, why are you going to a mountain?
Exactly. If this is the end of time and the destruction of the entire world, why are you worried about going back into your house and getting anything? Why give the warning? Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. Oh, yeah, it's right there. Fleeing to the mountains. What good are mountains going to do?
Brings you higher so that you go up first.
Yeah. Get a front row seat so you can see everything happen. So just right there, he's telling them to do this from the standpoint of, okay, if you want to be safe, then this is where you need to go. And we know from secular history, secular writings like Josephus, that in fact, those Christians that were still in Jerusalem and still in the area of Palestine, that when the Roman soldiers started making their way down, they did this very thing. They took off. And they literally ran for the hills, because that's what Jesus said to do. And then just the further description. Woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. And it's just, well, if this is the end of the world, why is that going to be a problem? This is just it. It's over. No, because those that are going to try to run, those that are going to try to flee, if you've got little children, it's going to be even more difficult for you to try to go. And this ties into the discussion of 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And how that Paul ends up writing to those brethren that because of the present distress, how are they going to live? It's all in discussion of marriage, husband and wives. But because of how things are going to get and how things are, what about that husband-wife relationship?
Leave them.
So it's not just a situation of,
Not to marry.
it's better not to marry.
But then it's better to marry than to burn.
Paul even says, because of how things are getting, it's going to end up being a situation you're going to end up living as though you don't have a wife, or that you don't have a husband. Now, here's the other element to that. When we're thinking about, so it's hemmed in and it's focusing into Judea, where all of this is coming down. But is Jerusalem, is Judea, Israel proper there in the land of Canaan, are they the only ones that are going to be affected by this? All right, I see one shaking no. How do you know that?
That's the question again.
No. You already answered.
Well, the Jews come from all over.
Okay. Not only are the Jews all over, but where are all the Christians?
All over.
Christians are all over. And we know from reading the book of Acts that from a Gentile and Roman viewpoint, were they really able to tell the difference between a Jew and a Christian? Now, there are some differences, but when you're thinking about overall manner of life and purity and virtue and all these different kinds of things, is there a lot of difference between a Christian and a Jew? No. And then also when you're considering that most of the Christian population is made up of Jews. When you have the Roman army coming into Jerusalem to wage war on this group of people, guess where they're going to have to come from? Of course, they're going to come from Rome. Let me ask that differently. They're going to come from Rome. Where are they going to have to travel through? I don't have a map, but if you go to the back of your Bibles, I'm sure most of you do have maps. So find you a map that has a large view to where you can see Rome on the Italian peninsula and then Jerusalem. So you're wanting to have a big picture of the Mediterranean Sea. Now remember that Titus is coming with an army, can't remember if it's 60,000 or 600,000. But either way, it's a lot. And during that time frame, how are you going to get 60,000 or 600,000 men from Rome over to Palestine? Mm-mm. Not a force that big. You're going to have to march them. And then you remember Titus actually was in Macedonia when he was sent to besiege Jerusalem. And your maps, so next time I'll get a map put up here. Macedonia is just west of Asia, where Ephesus, Galatia, Laodicea, and those churches are located. So a lot of people, when they read the Revelation and they see that this revelation is being given to these 7 churches of Asia, and they raise the question, why do they need to be concerned about what's happening in Jerusalem? They're not in Jerusalem. That's the reason why. Is because Rome is going to be marching its armies through these areas where these churches are located. And they're in just as much danger as the people of Jerusalem. Even Corinth, for that matter. So a large portion of the army is going to be marched, but there's going to be some that are sent by boat, and Corinth is a huge shipping hub. And we're getting these reports that Christians are causing issues.
So they're just told to go purge.
Yeah, they're just told to go clean up. We've got a rebellion, squash it. And thus the warnings go out. This is going to happen, and you're going to be caught in the middle of it. Collateral damage always happens with war. So when we're thinking about the Corinthian letter, the Revelation, those 7 churches of Asia, yeah, they're away from Jerusalem. But in going in to do damage to the Jews, and especially if you pick up Josephus and you read the sections about Titus actually making his way to Jerusalem, and which even then, the things that happened before leading up to them actually getting there, the Jews, oh man, you want to talk about low down some of the things that they did. So one thing in particular I remember reading over the weekend as I was refreshing myself on some of this. Before Titus's father, Vespasian, goes back to Rome, so no, it's when he goes back to Rome to take his position as the new head of the Roman Empire, to calm down the rebellion, Vespasian actually sends delegates to the heads of the Jewish leaders inside of Jerusalem so as to bring about a peace treaty. And the Jewish leaders at the time agree to meet with these delegates and even give an oath that they're going to allow these delegates to come in peace. Guess what the Jews did? They broke the oath and they killed the Roman delegates. And the Roman delegates took the Jews at their word to where they didn't even come with any weapons. And the record says that as they were being slain, these Roman delegates, as they were being slain, they didn't cry out with any cursings or anything like that on the Jews. They just simply cried out, "The oath, the oath." Now, that's the kind of behavior that the Jews were involved in before Rome comes in. What do you think the attitude of the Romans are? No quarter. No mercy. And then you got these two groups that are so similar in their characteristics as just, we're not taking the time to interrogate. We're not taking the time to investigate who's who. You're just done. And thus, though we're looking at this and Jesus says, okay, this is happening to Judea, it's not to lose sight that this is also going to happen anywhere else that Jews are located. So the warning of this gospel, the warning of this message is going out into all the world. Because the fight's not just going to be in Jerusalem. There were battles all the way down. To where, as we're looking at what's being said here in Jerusalem, it's going to apply to Corinth and all those 7 churches. And thus, just attaching all that together to how the Revelation continues to fit into this. All right, so thoughts, comments on that as we move forward? Okay, so it wasn't really something I was planning on getting into, obviously, because I didn't have it in the PowerPoint, but it's one of those things that fits. But next time I'll have a map that traces all of that out for us. All right, so as we said, if this is the end of the world, then what good is going to the mountains? Doesn't fit. If this is in the end of the world, there really would be no temptation to go and get your possessions. You're just leaving it all behind. 1 Timothy 6:7, we brought nothing into this world, we can't take anything out. So if we're looking at this as being the end, then okay, we recognize this is just it. Everything's done. So then, as we mentioned, the problems with being with child and everything like that. So as we're saying, what difference does the destruction of the earth, especially in wintertime or even on the Sabbath? So who knows the reason for bringing that element of it up? Pray that your time of travel is not on the Sabbath day. According to Nehemiah 13:17 through 19, they had so polluted the Sabbath day, they had to institute a rule that the gates would be closed to the city, to where there's no commerce, there's no business, there's no work being done. And that was a rule that they continued to follow up to the time frame of Christ.
Nehemiah what?
13:17 through 19.
Thank you.
To where if this happens on the Sabbath day and you're in Jerusalem, you are not getting out, because everything's going to be closed. Verse 21, for then, after all these things, and you're seeing the armies circle about, for then shall be great tribulation, such as what was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. All we hear about from people today is how we're looking forward to this happening. But Jesus said this was for them. It's for this generation. So these things have already happened. And you look at the description, and then you read this description, and then you go over and you read the Revelation. And you just read about all the tribulation that's being talked about there. And how even John himself, he says he was a partaker in the tribulation. He says, I am your brother in tribulation and in the kingdom. So those things were already at play. All the terrible things that are described in that letter, and then explain to me, try to tell me how it does not match with what Jesus is warning about here. There shall be great tribulation, tribulation so much as was not since the beginning of the world. You mean even worse than the flood of Noah? Yeah, even worse than the flood of Noah. Even worse than the destruction of Egypt? Swallowed up in the Red Sea? Yeah, even worse than that. Sodom and Gomorrah? On and on, the list can go, yeah. It's going to be worse than that. And then you read about all the terrible and frightful things that's described in the Revelation. It's one and the same. Can't get any worse. And even Jesus says, nor ever shall be. And that this great tribulation is connected to the destruction of Jerusalem. We're still in the same context. We are still on the same subject matter. But even with everything that's being described, and we're thinking about this coming from the standpoint of God's judgment on His people. And then you have verse 22, and except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake those days shall be shortened. Here we are in the midst of all of this, and buddy, you better take off when you see these things happen. And it's going to be so bad that history is going to record it, and there's not going to be anything like it. And then there's verse 22. What is this a description of, a depiction of, in the midst of all of this destruction and chaos and judgment? Hope. In the midst of all of this, there still is mercy and compassion. Your judgment is coming, but even in the midst of your judgment coming, I'm going to make a way out. There's going to be an opportunity for you to escape. And thus we have an illustration of what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5 about going the extra mile. At the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, they had already killed the Son of God. At that time, they'd already persecuted many of the church, persecuted the apostles, killed many of the apostles. And now the time of judgment is upon them. And yet God still says, I'm going to give you one last chance to go. And we don't need to lose sight of that. We do not need to lose sight allow our brains to shut off and just like, okay, we're focusing in on this, and we're focusing in on this, and we see all this turmoil, and then we bypass this. And especially when you consider what Luke says about this in describing these days, Luke 21 and verse 22. For these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. What is it that those that were slain, that are under the altar, what are they crying out?
Vengeance.
Well, it's not just vengeance. Vengeance is incorporated in that. How long? How long?
Until they're avenged.
Until justice is brought out. And then Luke records these days. These are the days of vengeance. Vengeance on whom?
On the Jews.
It's on the Jews. God's own people. Because at that point, the Jews are not God's people anymore. As Jesus said, the kingdom will be taken from you and given to a people that will bring forth fruit. John had already said, do not boast of yourselves that you are the seed of Abraham. For God can raise up seed out of these stones unto Abraham. And even here, we have a picture of what Paul ends up writing about in the Roman letter about God's vengeance and how it's brought about. How does God's vengeance operate? God's vengeance does not have to operate in a miraculous type of way, to where He from heaven has to come down and do something personally. God's vengeance can be executed by material beings. So a lot of people have a misconception about that passage there in Romans, that for us, that we're not allowed to take vengeance in our own hands. Because, oh, that's God's and He deals with it. That's true, but sometimes God uses man to exercise His vengeance. But even with that, even under the Old Testament system, which is still a law that we are within our rights to practice today, what about a man that kills another man? What is he supposed to be afraid of? And to ask it more directly, who is he supposed to be afraid of?
Family of the one he killed. The family of the one he killed.
In the Old Testament, they're described as the avenger of blood. Family members that are coming to take vengeance for the one that's slain. And that's Genesis 9, 5, and 6. Man that sheds man's blood, what happens?
What will be required?
His blood shall be shed by man. That's vengeance. But this is what is also describing these days of Matthew 24. These are the days of vengeance. You take vengeance upon an enemy. Those that had killed the prophets, from Abel to the innocent blood of Zacharias. Those who crucified the Son of God, that killed the apostles, persecuted our brethren, they're going to get what's theirs. And they did. Now, if this is how God operates, then what kind of comfort can we take if we, as the very elect of God, we are striving to walk in the steps of the Savior, and we're striving to be faithful in all that we do, and then we end up finding ourselves being persecuted? What can we take comfort in?
God's vengeance.
God's vengeance
There's hope.
on those people. They are not going to get away with it. And that's what Zechariah said as he was being slain by the king. The Lord that sees all shall require it. At the end of this, everybody's going to get their just deserves. And that should be an encouraging factor for the apostles. Because in the midst of this, in Mark's account and Luke's account, they add in there the element of Jesus warning them, you are going to be persecuted. Many of you are going to be killed. But here's what this day is. This day is vengeance. And if you put yourself back here and you're thinking about all the things that our brethren had to go through, vengeance is sweet. There is nothing wrong with seeking vengeance when it's just. And a lot of people want to try to make a distinction between the two. Well, vengeance isn't justice. Says who? My Bible says it is. And that this vengeance is being executed by man. It's not uncruel. It's not unkind. Because it's being exercised on criminals. We have to view this from the standpoint of the victims. What about the victims? And for them to have this happen, it's justice. (24:23). Then, if any man shall say unto you, Lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not. For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. So again, we have the possibility of deception upon those who are saved, and those who should know better. Behold, I have told you before. Wherefore, if they shall say unto you, Behold, he is in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he is in the secret chambers, believe it not. For as the lightning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Now again, as we're thinking about this from the standpoint of our denominational friends and their premillennial view, what is their mindset when it comes to the coming of the Son of Man? What's a key factor to the premillennialist view of Christ returning?
He's going to set foot on the ground.
Okay, he's going to set foot on this earth.
Reign for 1,000 years.
All right. Set foot, Jerusalem, and
Reign for 1,000 years?
reign for 1,000 years, but I can't remember which Old Testament prophet that makes the reference that he'll have one foot on the Mount of Olives and another foot sit on another one of the hills on the Temple Mount. But look at what Jesus is warning them about. If any man shall say unto you, Lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not. So what about people that say, oh, he's coming back to Jerusalem?
Believe it not.
Don't believe it. There shall arise false Christs and false prophets, showing great signs and wonders, deceiving the very elect. Behold, I have told you before. Wherefore, if they shall say unto you, Behold, he is in the desert. Or behold, he's in the secret chambers. These are all physical locations. He says, believe it not. So just a careful reading of this, people should recognize. Jesus was already warning. They try to tell you that I'm somewhere physical, that I'm in some secret location. Don't believe it. But yeah, that's what everybody's believing today. What you got?
So again, that's why Thomas should be praised.
Exactly. This is why Thomas should not be getting the kind of grief that a lot of people want to put on him. Oh, he was doubting. Jesus warned them. These kind of things would happen. He's doing his due diligence. And even with that, Jesus doesn't give any type of rebuke to Thomas when he talks to him anyways. Yeah. Verse 27. For as the lightning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Now, this is one of those sections that brings some confusion into this element. Because when we're thinking about this verse and the description that's being made, What does it sound like?
Boom, the second coming.
Okay, boom, the second coming. But then when you think about the description of as lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even unto the west. Does that sound like just a localized event? Or with that kind of description, does it actually sound like, well, it sounds like everybody's going to be able to see this? As far as the east is from the west? So how do we make sense of it? Because we have been discussing it from the standpoint of, okay, this is a localized event. Those that are in Judea flee to the mountains. This is to this generation.
Well, what comes to my mind when I read that, but maybe I'm off, is you don't know. Lightning is unpredictable. You don't know. So take it with the second part of that sentence. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be, is nobody knows. But
Yeah.
that's just a cursory, trying to explain.
No, and that's good. So it is the element of, so, but even with that, when you're thinking about, there's still the unknown about lightning strike. There are still some elements to where it's about to happen though, right? Because now with our recording capabilities that we have, I think there was actually a video floating around just recently about some people that were on a cruise ship and lightning was about to strike and you can see their hair like standing up on end and they're just all standing there recording like nothing's about to happen. It's like, you guys about to be chicken fried. So even with that, it's like, okay, here are these things that are beginning to happen where we know something is coming, but exactly when, we don't know. All right, so that's true. But when we're thinking about the visibility of this, it's a description of the coming of the Son of Man, and here's what it's going to be like. It's going to be like lightning flashing across the sky from the east to the west. And people want to try to make that a universal. Everybody's going to see this from the east, from the west. But is that how a lightning strike works? Lightning flashes across the sky here in Montana and they can see it in China? No.
Their balloons here.
Yeah.
So maybe they could.
When lightning flashes across the sky here, yeah, it lights up everything, east to the west. But they don't see that in North Dakota, South Dakota. They don't see that in Wyoming. So even with this is still describing a localized event. This happening to the destruction of Jerusalem, yeah, as it is from the east to the west, bam! It's there. We see it. But you're not taking this and then stretching it out. Okay, you see there now we've moved from this to a universal. No, this is still localized. And that he's still talking to his apostles that are going to be in Jerusalem, the church that's going to be in Jerusalem, and this generation. You are seeing this, and it's clear, and it's evident like lightning flashing through the sky. That when you see these things happening, you're not going to miss it. 28, for wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles, vultures, be gathered together. Who's this carcass?
The Hebrew system.
The Hebrews and the Jews still under this system. So what does this say about the Jewish system at the time that the church started, the apostles start taking the gospel out? Jesus is describing the Jewish system as dead already. Just as Lazarus was 4 days in the grave in the tomb, Lord, he stinketh. And that's what you have the nation of Israel is being described as. It's a carcass that's laying out there in the sun, decaying. What does that do? That attracts eagles, vultures. And coincidentally enough, what was the national symbol
I was gonna say it.
of the Roman army? It was an eagle.
It's America. No.
Different kind of eagle. And thus he's perfectly illustrating. He's perfectly describing what is about to transpire. And it fits in perfectly with what he's already described. Behold, your house is left unto you desolate. Our same word from Matthew 24. When you see the abomination of desolation, your house is desolate. It stinks. And somebody's about to come and take it. Matthew 21:13, and said unto them, it is written, my house shall be called the house of prayer, but ye have made it a den of thieves. Here's Jesus describing the Jewish system. Dead, not dying. They are DOA, dead on arrival. So to say that God had any amount of respect for the temple, for the Jewish system, after the start of the New Testament, and the church, and the gospel of Christ, is to ignore what is being clearly described here. Desolate, den of thieves, it's a carcass. And thus the shift had taken place from the Jews to the Christians. And that's an important point because we have a section inside the religious world, the denominational world. Andrew Sluter, for example, is one of the ones, like he denies to the greatest degree of, what do they call it? It's not the transition doctrine or I think it's the substitution doctrine, to where the church ends up being substituted for Jerusalem or for the Jews. He denies that. He, like many others, still believes, we got to take care of Israel. We got to take care of the Jews. Christ is coming back. God still loves them, which granted, God does still love them. But here's how he viewed them way back here. This is done. So again, when we're thinking about the financial strain that's being put on our country, how much of our taxes go over to the protection of that piece of dirt over there? A whole lot.
More than it does to us.
Exactly. And why is that? That's the Holy Land. Nothing holy about it. It's just, what is it?
All the bomb holes.
Oh yeah,
Sorry.
it's like Swiss cheese over there.
Cheese.
That's all it is, just a piece of dirt like anything else. So just, not just the salvation principles that are involved in this. Look at what it's doing to our country financially. The turmoil and the stress that it's putting us in because people do not study their Bibles correctly.
I think it's funny that, why is that piece of dirt the holy place? Well, it's because God said at one time that this is the holy place, but yet they can't see that baptism is essential for salvation.
Yeah.
It's like, well, God said, what's so special about water? There's nothing special except for God said.
What God said about it. Yeah, if God, back in the Old Testament, if God had not put his name there, like he said he would, it'd have been just like any place else. But the fact that God did put his name there and said, this is where I want you to come, and this is what I want you to do here, That's what gives it its relevance. Thus, the same thing with the church today. What makes the church important? Because of what God has said about the church. What makes Christianity important? It's what God has said about Christianity. The New Testament, the Lord's Supper, our singing, our praying, our giving, baptism, all the different elements. What makes it important? It's what God said about it. So if God shifts from one element to another, He has the right to do that. It's His prerogative. But even with the shift that takes place, He's been warning the people all about it. So you cannot ignore these clear landmarks. But a lot of people do. But as we've been discussing, this has also happened in the Old Testament. In Ezekiel chapter 10. Ezekiel 10 describes the glory of God leaving the temple before the Babylonians come in and lay siege. So I would encourage you in your time in this upcoming week, if you're involved in your own personal reading, go back and read Ezekiel 10. And it's just like, hey, this has happened before. This isn't anything new. Why are you so surprised? All right. Now we're not going to have time. Yeah. We'll stop in verse 29 because we'll need to discuss, then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. So put your place marker there. We'll come back to this, Lord willing, next week. So any thoughts, questions, comments as we bring this to a close? What you got?
It's just how spoiled the Jews got to be, to kill the Son of God, and to kill those delegates that you're saying.
Yeah.
So God says, okay, I'm going to hand this, you were my people, you are no longer my people, now I'm going to hand this over to the elect, to these people, and that's us.
Yeah.
And how we should treat that. And how special we should feel, but not, now we've got it.
Yeah.
But like, okay, this could happen to us, and ultimately it will with hell in the end. But
And that's even found in the Roman letter when you're looking at Romans 10 and 11, where Paul is describing Yeah, 11. It was pretty much the entire chapter, but when you get down to verse 13, 13 through the remainder of the chapter, where Paul ends up discussing about the grafting in of the Gentiles. And Paul says very clearly how, okay, you're being grafted in to this tree with the Jews, but then at the same time, the natural branches are being cut off so that you can be grafted in. And what does Paul warn them about? What does he tell them not to do? Okay, as you're being grafted in and these other ones are being cut off, do not start glorying and boasting in the fact that you're grafted in and they're now being cut off. You can be cut off just like they were cut off. And then also to, just the Jews' behavior. They really never changed. So what I brought up about the Jews before the destruction of Jerusalem and how they treated the Roman delegates, you go back into Ezra and Nehemiah, and I believe it's Ezra specifically. The Jews almost did not get to go home. And the reason why was because the Samaritans that wanted to come over and help in the building of the temple, but they were rejected. They went back to Cyrus and they started reading to Cyrus from some of the Old Testament scriptures, and they started accusing the Jews of they're rebellious, they're stiff-necked, they're hard-hearted. And all that was true. And so they were trying to deceive Cyrus and saying, okay, you let them go, this is what's going to happen. This is how they've behaved the whole entire time. Which for that span of time they did not, which was good. But just as Jordan brought up, what ends up happening in the life of Christ? They get right back into that cycle. We're special. We're elite. And instead of serving others with that attitude, they started trying to rule over others. And that's the kind of the bad behavior. But even with this last thing, we're done. Even with that, you go way back in Israel's history to the time frame of Jacob and his sons. I'm trying to remember the exact chapter in Genesis. I think it's before they sold Joseph into slavery. But if you remember, one of their sisters ends up being raped. Well, I can't say rape because it's actually not described that way. But she ends up going into a Gentile nation, and the Gentile nation comes to them and says, well, we want to make peace. And then what did they do?
They took over for their father and made the decision of retribution.
All right, and what was it?
Circumcision.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
they
You-
were kind of sneaky about it, and
Oh,
they
this-
destroyed them.
Yeah. They said, okay, we'll make an agreement with you if you'll circumcise yourselves.
Wait till they're all sore.
And they were all sore, and they came in and destroyed all of them. That is low down.
That's smart.
It's smart, but that'd be like us using the Lord's Supper. And we poison the bread, or we poison the grape juice. You're taking something of God's that's a sign of covenant and relationship between you and Him, and you pervert it to something like that. That's
Not
their,
smart.
That's their forefathers. That's bad. That's bad. But even with that, we're showing that coming into covenant with God and relationship with God does not just magically change who you are. You have got to put in the effort, and you've got to, man. Yeah, just got to be able to fight those kinds of things. So, all right. If nothing else, we'll stop there.